Meanwhile, God. This week we come to the close of our walk through the book of Genesis, and we come to one of my favorite stories in the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph. You know, Joseph really speaks to us, to the human experience, because his life is one that seemed to be so blessed, so favored, and yet, even at a young age, he began to experience the ups and downs of life, the tragedies, the trials. You know, this past week, as I was listening to the news, I wanted to laugh, I wanted to cry, because we live in a world filled with uncertainty. At our deacons meeting last week, we talked about what's happening with the coronavirus and its variants and what that means for our fall schedule at church. And someone said, well, we're just going to have to learn how to live with it. And I said, really? Then again, this uncertainty, this trouble is everywhere. You turn on the television and all you hear about is the crisis in Afghanistan. Everyone's pointing their finger at one another and nobody seems to know what to do. The good news is that it's taken the focus of all the violence that's going on in the streets of our major cities. Violent crime is up in some places almost 150%. Oh yeah, and then there's this hurricane that's barreling towards us up the coast called Henri. You know, Gilda Radner, the famous comedian, had a line that I like to quote. She actually used it as the title of her autobiography as she chronicled her battle with cancer. And she said, it's always something. If it wasn't cancer, it would be something else. And oh, how that speaks to life. Because life at its best is filled with challenges that threaten to undo us. Nobody knows that better than Joseph in our story today. He was the 11th son of Jacob. And I've always loved this story because it's a story of resilience. It's a story of faith. It's a story that reminds us, even when we can't see Him, God is at work behind the scenes. Joseph's story unfolds here in chapter 37, and there's so much that we can learn from it, and I just want to pick out a couple of lessons today. You see, Joseph experienced life in a way that few have, and yet he never stopped believing in God's faithfulness. Let me begin with a little background. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, born to his beloved Rachel, and his brothers hated him for it. What made matters worse was the fact that Joseph was also a dreamer. In all of his dreams, and he wasn't shy about sharing them, he was the star. Even his father and mother and his brothers in those dreams all seemed to bow down and worship him. When his father presented him with a multicolored, beautiful coat, it set them off. And it says they began to find a way to end him. From that point forward, they began to looking for a chance to shut him up once and for all. Well, that day arrived, as Steve read. He met them out in the field while they were working, and they grabbed him, stripped him of his fancy coat, and tossed him down in a dry well. While they were planning their next steps, and this is interesting because sometimes we miss this. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to destroy him. But one of the brothers said, no, let's wait. God spared his life. The Ishmaelites, the Midianite traders passed by, and someone suggested they sell him into slavery, figuring that would be the end of him, and he'd end up down forgotten forever in Egypt. Then they came up with that story to tell their father, and the rest is history. But you see, that wasn't the end of the story. In true Paul Harvey fashion, you remember Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, the end of this passage reads like this: meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt, and in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Meanwhile, the story continues, and the word meanwhile suggests that there's more to come. That's not the end. He's not sent off and never heard from again. His brothers believed he's as good as dead, and the dream's silenced. But then comes this word meanwhile, hinting at this something more. The story does continue. Joseph distinguishes himself in Potiphar's household. But before his dream can play out, Potiphar's wife accuses him of trying to take advantage of her, when it was really the other way around. Joseph was being a good boy, doing what was right, and even so, he was accused of doing wrong, and so he's sent to prison, and it looks like another defeat. What amazes me is that Joseph doesn't rattle the cages of heaven and scream how unfair this is. You or I might have done that. Let's be honest. We probably have done that once or twice in our life. Looked up and asked why. Instead, we read that Joseph spends his time in prison productively encouraging others. He reminds me of the Apostle Paul, who says that he learned the secret of how to be content in all things. You remember what Paul did when he was cast into prison, and one of the times we're told that he prayed, he sang hymns, and he was witnessing to the others who were in chains as well. Well, Joseph pretty much does the same thing when he's in prison, and it speaks to his deep trust that he has in God to work things out. He stops worrying about it and just continues to live faithfully in the meantime. And you know, the truth is, you and I are living in the meantime. Doesn't matter if you're 10 years old or you're 90 years old. We are here in the between time of birth and death and are being raised up into the eternal kingdom. If Joseph were here today in this world, he wouldn't run around complaining about the pandemic. He'd simply continue to do all he could to bring glory to God. And I think we really need to hear that right now. Because sometimes we could be pretty big complainers, can't we? I know I am. Confession here, right? So what does Joseph do? He makes an impression on the other prisoners, and they come to him with their dreams. And when one of his cellmates is freed and is reinstated in Pharaoh's court, he remembers Joseph. Because Pharaoh has a dream not too much down the road, and when he dreams and he asks everybody what this dream means, that person says, I know a man who can interpret dreams. His name is Joseph, and he's in your prison right now. Joseph comes up and he says, I can't answer your dream, but God of heaven and earth, the Creator God, can. And so he prayed, and God revealed the meaning of that dream. Pharaoh was so impressed with him that he raised Joseph up to become the second most powerful man in the world in that day. Meanwhile, there's that word again, meanwhile, Jacob's family is struggling in the midst of a famine up in Israel, and they need help. Jacob sends his sons to Egypt in search of assistance, and when they arrive there, they encounter the brother whom they sent into slavery and presumed dead, except they didn't know it was him. And there's a little bit more to that story. I encourage you to read it. But it's ironic, isn't it? They show up and bow down before the ruler of Egypt, who just happens to be that boy who had a dream that mirrored this situation years before. That's God in the meanwhile. For all that Joseph had suffered, Joseph realizes that this is the dream he had. It affirmed his faith and trust in God. God had never left him. He knew that, but this told him for sure. God was simply working it out in the meantime of Joseph's life. This story, Joseph's life, filled with unpredictable and sometimes cruel moments where despair and hopelessness could have overcome him, is a story of faith and a reminder that God never leaves us, even when it seems that He has. His purposes will never be deterred. You see, Joseph's story reminds us that God is involved in human affairs. He's not an absentee God. He didn't just create the world and then go off and He's going to come back someday. No, God has invested Himself in our lives, in the world. And that's what we see in Jesus, where it says, for God so loved the world that He sent His only Son to save the world. So as you look around you at what's happening on the world stage right now, or even in your own life at this moment, you can be assured that God cares and that He has a plan. We need to remember the meanwhile God when it looks like nothing is going to change, when everything is falling apart, when we work hard and have nothing to show for it. God is still working in the meantime. A long time had passed since God had given Joseph those dreams, and for many years it looked as if they would never be fulfilled. But there's something that's interspersed throughout Joseph's story while in Egypt. If you go back and read through that section, you will see that 3 times it says this, "But the Lord was with Joseph." It's almost like God is revealing there in this story where we could be caught up in despair over what was happening. We're reminded that even in the trouble, the Lord was with Joseph. In other words, even while it seemed like nothing was going on, God was doing something in Joseph's life. Living in the in-between can be fruitful as long as we believe that God is at work. When things look bad, we need to believe and remember that God is working and walking right beside us. It's so easy to forget, to look down in despair, but to remember to look up and remember that God is there. Here's another thing to note in Joseph's story. Don't let the detours rob you of your faith. Life is often filled with one detour after another on the way to fulfilling our dreams. Some of you know my story. In college, I went through a troubled time. I was a great high school student, and I had all kinds of dreams and ambitions, and one of them was to go into the ministry. And yet, I kind of made some mistakes, some bad choices along the way, and at one point it looked like all those dreams were for naught, that it wasn't to be. But God was with me. Probably you've had circumstances in your life in the same way, where all of a sudden something happened and it looked like you couldn't move forward, that nothing was ever going to happen that was productive or good. You're on a detour. But with every one of those detours for Joseph, God made it possible for him to move on to the next phase of the journey. Our problem is that we often see these detours as the end of the road, while in reality they're moving us into a place so that we can enter the next phase of our journey. That's the way that God often works. The interruptions, the inconveniences may be occasions for God to do His best work in us and through us. In other words, God uses whatever life brings, the good, the bad, and even the ugly, to accomplish His purposes. And there's this one last thing, and I hate to bring it up because it's the hardest to face. Meanwhile, also can speak to the evil that we see and experience in life. God can turn even the most horrific situations into something positive. The Apostle Paul says this, "And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose." Joseph, when his brothers finally realize who he is, begin to fear for their lives. But Joseph says, and I've always loved this, Joseph says this, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people." You know, there's no better expression of the power of God than this. God can take what others mean for evil and make it good. The ultimate illustration of this is Jesus' death upon the cross. They thought they had killed Him, but meanwhile, Jesus rose from the dead and is at the right hand of the Father, where all those who believe in Him will never perish, but have everlasting life. Meanwhile, says that God can use whatever life brings our way in order to accomplish His purpose, because God is in charge. Maybe you imagine your dreams are dead. Maybe your life has taken a sudden turn and you can't figure it out as to what's next. For some, you feel like a door is shutting for something that means a whole lot to you. Or perhaps you're in the meantime and nothing is happening at all. If that's the case, I want to encourage you to read Genesis 37. Read Joseph's story. so that it can remind you that God is working in the meantime of our lives. And I want to give you this word to take with you today. A storm is coming, but remember, meanwhile, God, He's still at work, working things out for good for those who love Him according to His purposes. Trust God. He will get you through. Amen. We want to close our service with the song